Have you come along for a story? Excellent. In that case, you are very welcome here in Storybeard's Story Cabin. Now, our story today comes from Scotland, and it involves two servants and a chap called the Laird of the Land. Maybe a few magical trees. So this, my friends, is the story of Jack and Mary and the dancing trees. And it goes a little something like this. Once upon a time it was, my friends. And twice upon a time it may not have been, because after all I am a storyteller. But once upon a time it was that there lived in Scotland, many years ago, a man who owned a great deal of land. And everybody who knew him just referred to him as Laird of the Land. Laird just means lord, ruler of the land. He had a great house with many doors and windows and 4 floors. And on the very top of the house was a small turret with windows on every side. And if you went up to the top of the house into that turret, then you could look out in every direction. As far as the eye could see, the Laird of the Land owned that property. All the land that he could survey. And to tell you the truth, he was not the most generous of men. In fact, he was downright mean. Why, if you had 5p, he'd take 10p away from you. And if you had 20p, he'd take 40p away from you. And if you had £1, well, he'd bop you on the head and take £2 from you. That's how mean he was. Now, despite the size of the house and the vast expanses of land that he owned, the Laird of the Land employed only 2 people to help him. One was called Jack, a young lad who did all the work on the outside of the house, and the other was called Mary, a young girl who did all the work on the inside of the house. To tell you the truth, the Laird of the Land paid them very little indeed. In fact, quite often they went to bed hungry because they had so little money to buy food. Now, Jack and Mary were great friends, and every lunchtime they would meet up to share what little food they had. If it was a fine day, then they would sit outside and eat maybe a little bread and a little bit of cheese. But if it was a rainy or stormy day, then they would go inside into one of the rooms that the Laird of the Land hardly ever used, into the library. And they would take down a book and they would start to read. Now, on the day of our story, Jack and Mary had gone to the library, for it was a great stormy day, despite the fact it was not far from midsummer, and there was lightning flashes going across the sky and rain was hammering down. And they took down from the shelves of the library one of the books that they'd never looked at before. And they opened it up, and inside that book they were amazed to find a story about the very house where they worked. The story said that at midnight on Midsummer's Eve, the 13 oak trees that stood in a great circle in front of the house would pull up their roots and go dancing off down to the river. And that if you then went and looked down in the holes left where the roots of the trees used to be, you would find treasure, gold and silver and gems and jewels. But, the book said, you should only take a little, enough to fill 1 pocket or maybe 2, otherwise something terrible will happen. It didn't say what, it just said something terrible will happen. Well, it was only 10 days until Midsummer's Eve. Jack and Mary were so excited. They thought here might be an opportunity to actually get some money. So they made their plans. They took down curtains from rooms around the house of the Laird, rooms he never used, and they fashioned those curtains into a rope. And then, as the sun went down on Midsummer's Eve, they hid round the corner of the house, looking out, peeking, taking it in turns to glance at the great circle of 13 trees. The sun went down, the moon came up, and on the very stroke of midnight, music started to play, coming from the very air itself. And one by one, the great oak trees that stood in the circle in front of the house pulled up their roots and started to dance, first left and then right. They danced round and round in a circle, faster and faster, and then off down the hill towards the river that ran just down from the house. Jack and Mary saw their chance. They ran over to one of the holes that had been left by an oak tree. They'd already decided that Jack would lower Mary down the hole because Jack was slightly stronger and would be more able to pull her back up, and Mary was slightly braver and was more willing to go down the hole. So Jack lowered Mary down into the hole on the end of the rope made from curtains. And when Mary touched the bottom of the hole, she called out, "Stop!" And she started looking around, looking down the long, thin tunnels left by the roots from the tree. And as she looked, she saw that there was indeed treasure, gold and silver, gems and jewels. She reached out a hand and she took a little gold and a little silver. She reached out another hand, she took a few gems and a few jewels. Jack called down, "Don't forget, only take enough to fill one pocket or maybe two." So once Mary had 2 pockets full, she called up to Jack, "I'm ready!" And she started to scramble up, and Jack pulled her up out of the hole, hand over hand, using that rope made of curtains. They were just about to scurry away when the big front door of the Laird of the Land's house opened, and out came the Laird himself. He had an enormous sack over one shoulder. Jack and Mary thought, "Oh no, he's come to steal our money." And then they thought, "We left the book out. We were so excited when we read the story, we left the book out. He must have gone to the library and read the same story." But to tell you the truth, the Laird of the Land wasn't interested in them. He walked over with his sack over his shoulder, went to the largest hole in the ground left by the largest oak tree, and without a moment's hesitation, whoom, poof, jumped straight down it. And then he looked along the tiny tunnels left by the roots, and he saw gold and silver, gems and jewels. He opened the sack that he'd been carrying over his shoulder. He reached out an arm and he scraped in an armful of gold and an armful of silver and many gems and tumbling piles of jewels. As he looked down the end of one of the twisting root lines, he saw a sparkling gold ring. And he thought to himself, "That must be mine." He reached out one hand and he went to take the ring. And as he reached out to take it, the root hole closed up around his arm. He looked down another root hole and he saw a glistening diamond. He reached out to take that, and the root hole closed up around that arm as well. Jack and Mary were standing nearby. They could see that the trees were starting to dance their way back up from the river. They went running over to where the Laird of the Land was in the hole, and they shouted down. They said, "Laird, Laird, the trees are coming back. Let go of the treasure." Do you think he would let go? No, not a bit of it. They called down a second time. They said, "Laird, Laird, the trees are coming quickly. Please let go of the treasure." Do you think he would listen? Not at all. They called a third time. They said, "Laird, Laird, the trees are almost here. You must climb back up. Let go go of the treasure." Do you think he would pay any attention? Of course not. And at that point, Jack and Mary had to dash back round the corner of the house, for the 13 dancing oak trees had come back up to the circle of holes that they had left in the ground. And they started to go round and round those holes, faster and faster and faster. And one by one, they leapt into the air, spun round and came down, boomp, into the holes. Till only the largest oak tree was left. It jumped high up, span 3 times, came down, boomp, and squashed the laird of the land flat. So flat, you could have put him in an envelope and sent him home to his mum. Jack and Mary crept away back round into the house. And I'm pleased to tell you that from that day on, they always had enough to eat. And that house, well, that passed the ownership of one of the laird's distant cousins, who was a large, jolly man who liked nothing more than parties. And he kept Jack and Mary working with him, and he paid them a good wage. And every Midsummer's Eve, they would have a party, with Jack and Mary as the guests of honour. And the first song that was always played was da 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 dum dee dum dee dum dee dum dee da dee da da dee da. And that, my friends, is the story of Jack and Mary and the Dancing Trees. Thank you so much for listening. If you've enjoyed the story, remember to subscribe to the YouTube channel, and I hope to see you back here again in the Story Cabin for more stories very soon. Until then, take care and bye-bye.